I should have known something was wrong when I saw Brenda Patterson standing at the edge of my property with a clipboard. Her lips pressed into that tight line that every homeowner in Timber Ridge Estates, Montana, had learned to fear. I had just finished my morning coffee on the deck of my cabin, enjoying the view of the mountains that stretched beyond the pine forest, when I noticed her bright yellow pantsuit moving through the trees like a warning beacon. My name is Harrison Foster, and I had bought this 3-acre plot 2 years ago, built my dream cabin with my own 2 hands, and thought I had finally found peace after 30 years of corporate life in Seattle. The cabin was modest but perfect, built from local timber with a natural wood finish that blended beautifully with the surrounding forest. I had chosen every plank, every nail, every detail to create something that felt like it belonged in these woods. Brenda was the president of our HOA, a position she had held for 8 years and wielded like a medieval monarch with a scepter. She was 53, had perfectly highlighted blonde hair that never moved in the wind, and seemed to believe that her primary purpose in life was to ensure every property in our community adhered to what she called elevated standards of aesthetic excellence. I set down my mug and walked down the deck steps to meet her, already feeling my jaw tighten. This was her 3rd visit in as many months. The first time, she had complained that my mailbox was 2 inches too tall. The second time, she had issued a warning because I had left my truck parked in the driveway for more than 72 consecutive hours, which apparently violated some obscure rule buried in page 47 of the HOA covenant. "Morning, Brenda," I called out, trying to keep my voice neutral. She looked up from her clipboard and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She had found something and she was pleased about it. "Harrison, I'm glad I caught you. We need to discuss a serious violation." I crossed my arms and leaned against one of the deck posts. "What is it this time?" She consulted her clipboard with exaggerated attention to detail. "Your cabin is in direct violation of Section 12.4 of the HOA Architectural Guidelines regarding approved exterior colors." She looked up at me, waiting for a reaction. "The natural wood finish you've chosen is not on the approved color palette." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Natural wood? We're in the middle of a forest, Brenda. It's a log cabin." "I'm aware of what it is," she said crisply. "However, the Architectural Review Board has determined that all structures must be painted in one of the approved colors. You have beige, taupe, sage green, slate gray, or colonial blue as options. The natural wood finish, while I'm sure you find it attractive, is not compliant." My blood pressure was rising. I could feel it in my temples. "I built this cabin 2 years ago. I submitted all my plans to the Architectural Review Board. They approved everything." Brenda smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "The previous Architectural Review Board. We've updated our standards. All homeowners received notification 6 months ago about the new color requirements. You have 30 days to repaint your cabin, or you'll face fines of $500 per day until the violation is corrected." "That's insane," I said, no longer trying to hide my anger. "This cabin is 2,000 square feet. Do you have any idea how much it would cost to paint the entire exterior? Not to mention covering up beautiful natural timber with paint is basically a crime against craftsmanship." "Those are the rules, Harrison. If you don't like them, you're welcome to attend the monthly HOA meetings and voice your concerns. But the violation stands." She made a note on her clipboard. "You have until June 22nd. I'll be back to verify compliance." She turned and walked back toward her golf cart, which she had parked on the dirt road that led to my property. I stood there, watching her drive away, feeling a rage building inside me that I hadn't experienced since my days dealing with incompetent executives in Seattle. I had moved here to escape exactly this kind of bureaucratic nonsense. That evening, I pulled out my copy of the HOA Covenant and Guidelines, all 93 pages of it, and started reading. I read through dinner. I read late into the night, and by 2 in the morning, I had found what I was looking for. There was nothing in the original covenant about exterior colors. The updated guidelines that Brenda kept referencing had been added by the current board without a proper vote from the community members. According to the bylaws, any changes to architectural standards required a 2/3 vote from all homeowners in Timber Ridge estates. I had ammunition for a fight, but I also knew how these things went. Brenda would drag this out, tie me up in committees and meetings and procedural challenges, and even if I eventually won, I'd spend months dealing with her harassment. She'd find other violations, other excuses to make my life difficult. I had watched her do it to other homeowners who had dared to challenge her authority. I needed a different approach. The idea came to me around 3 in the morning, when I was half delirious from caffeine and frustration. I was looking at pictures of my cabin on my phone, admiring the craftsmanship when an advertisement popped up on my screen for hunting gear. Specifically, camouflage patterns, military-grade concealment technology, and suddenly, the solution was clear. If Brenda wanted me to change the color of my cabin, I would change the color of my cabin, just not in the way she expected. The next morning, I drove into Missoula, about 40 miles south of Timber Ridge, and spent 6 hours researching and shopping. I visited hunting supply stores, talked to military surplus dealers, and consulted with a guy named Dave who specialized in custom camouflage for everything from tree stands to hunting blinds. By the end of the day, I had a plan and a truck full of supplies. Dave had been particularly helpful. He was in his 60s, built like a barrel, with a white beard that made him look like a lumberjack Santa Claus. When I explained what I wanted to do, he had laughed so hard he nearly fell off his stool. "You want to camouflage your entire cabin?" he asked, wheezing with amusement. "That's the idea." "Because of the HOA, exactly." He wiped tears from his eyes and nodded. "Son, I've been waiting my whole life to help someone with a project like this. Let's make your cabin disappear." Over the next 3 weeks, I worked 12-hour days. Dave came out to help on weekends, and together, we transformed my cabin into something that would have made a military camouflage expert proud. We started with a base coat of paint that matched the predominant colors of the surrounding forest, various shades of green, brown, and gray. But we didn't just slap on a single color. We used a technique called disruptive patterning, breaking up the outline of the cabin with irregular shapes and color variations that mimicked the dappled light and shadow of the forest. We studied the specific trees around my property, mostly ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch, and matched the bark patterns. We added texture to the paint using specialized rollers and techniques that Dave had learned from years of creating hunting blinds. We painted fake branches and shadows. We installed mesh netting over parts of the roof and walls, then wove real pine boughs and foliage into the netting. The deck railings got special attention. We wrapped them in camouflage fabric and added artificial moss and lichen. The windows were the trickiest part. We couldn't block them completely, but we installed specialized film that was reflective from the outside, showing only the forest while remaining transparent from the inside. My nearest neighbor, a retired engineer named Philip Gomez who lived about half a mile down the road, stopped by during the second week. He stood at the edge of my property, staring at the cabin, then walked around it twice before speaking. "Harrison," he said finally, "I can barely see your cabin and I'm standing 50 feet away from it." "That's the point," I said, stepping down from the ladder where I had been painting a realistic-looking shadow along the roofline. Philip started laughing. "This is about Brenda, isn't it? She wants me to paint my cabin one of her approved colors, so I'm painting it." "That's beautiful," he said, shaking his head. "That's absolutely beautiful. She's going to lose her mind. That's what I'm counting on." By the end of the 3rd week, the transformation was complete. My cabin had effectively vanished into the forest. Standing on the dirt road, the same place where Brenda had parked her golf cart, you could barely tell there was a structure there at all. Your eyes wanted to slide right past it, reading it as just more trees and shadows. Only if you knew exactly where to look and what you were looking for could you make out the subtle geometry of walls and roof beneath the camouflage. From inside, everything was normal. The windows still provided beautiful views of the mountains. The deck was still functional. But from outside, my cabin had become a ghost. June 22nd arrived, and I was ready. I spent the morning sitting on my deck, drinking coffee and waiting. Right on schedule at 10 o'clock, I heard the electric whine of Brenda's golf cart coming up the dirt road. I stayed where I was, concealed by the camouflage netting and forest patterns. The golf cart stopped at the usual spot. Brenda got out, clipboard in hand, and looked toward where my cabin should be. She froze. I watched as confusion spread across her face. She took a few steps forward, squinting into the trees. She pulled out her phone, presumably checking the GPS or property maps, then looked up again. "What in the world?" she muttered. She walked further onto my property, moving past the spot where she normally stopped, getting closer to the cabin. I could see her from where I sat, perfectly camouflaged, but she was clearly having trouble seeing the structure. She walked right past the edge of the deck, so close that I could have reached out and tapped her shoulder, and still didn't seem to recognize what she was looking at. Finally, she pulled out her phone and made a call. I could hear her side of the conversation clearly. "Margaret, this is Brenda. I'm at the Foster property and something very strange is going on. I can't seem to find his cabin. No, I'm not joking. I'm standing right where it should be and all I see is trees. Can you pull up the property records and confirm the address?" "Yes, I'll hold." I took a sip of my coffee, thoroughly enjoying the moment. Brenda paced back and forth, getting increasingly agitated. "Yes, I'm here. Lot 47, 3.2 acres. But Margaret, there's no cabin here. I'm telling you, it's just forest." "Well, there was a cabin here 3 weeks ago. A 2,000 square foot log cabin. Structures don't just vanish." She listened for a moment, then snapped. "I'm not confused, and I certainly don't need to make an appointment with a doctor. Something very suspicious is happening here, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." She hung up and stood there, hands on her hips, staring into the forest. She was looking right at my cabin, but her brain wasn't processing what she was seeing. The camouflage was working even better than I had hoped. Finally, with a frustrated huff, she stormed back to her golf cart and drove away. I waited until she was completely gone, then called Dave. "It worked," I told him. "She stood 15 feet from the deck and couldn't find the cabin." His laughter boomed through the phone. "I wish I could have seen her face. That's the best thing I've heard all year." Over the next few days, things escalated. Brenda came back twice more, each time with different people. The first time, she brought Margaret from the HOA office, a thin woman in her 40s who seemed perpetually nervous. The second time, she brought 2 other board members, including the vice president, a real estate agent named Kenneth Wolfe, who spent most of his time on his phone. Each time, they would park the golf cart, walk around my property, and struggle to identify where the cabin actually was. Margaret eventually got close enough to the deck that she noticed something wasn't quite right. The pattern seemed a little too regular, the shadows a little too geometric. But by then, Brenda had called everyone back to the golf cart, muttering about trespassing and property surveys being wrong. Kenneth, to his credit, seemed to figure out what was happening. I watched him from my concealed position on the deck as he stared at the cabin, his eyes slowly tracing the outline of the structure. A smile twitched at the corner of his mouth, and he shook his head slightly. When Brenda demanded to know what he was looking at, he just said, "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," in a tone that suggested he was enjoying this as much as I was. The June 22nd deadline passed. I received no violation notice, no fine, nothing. How could they fine me for not painting a cabin they couldn't find? Week later, I got a certified letter. Inside was a notice stating that the HOA had indefinitely postponed the enforcement of my color violation due to administrative complications. It was signed by Brenda, and I could practically feel her fury radiating off the page. I thought that might be the end of it, but I should have known better. Brenda Patterson was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. 2 weeks after the deadline, I was in Timber Ridge at the small general store that served our community, buying groceries, when I overheard Brenda talking to a group of other residents. She was holding court near the produce section, her voice carrying across the store. "I'm telling you, something illegal is going on at the Foster property," she was saying. "Structures don't just disappear. He's either demolished it without a permit, which violates county building codes, or he's done something to deliberately obscure it, which violates our HOA covenants regarding property maintenance and appearance." One of the other residents, a woman I recognized but didn't know well, asked, "Have you actually talked to him about it?" "He refuses to respond to my calls or emails," Brenda said, which was true. I had been ignoring her increasingly frantic messages. "Which is further evidence that he's hiding something. I've filed a complaint with the county building inspector. They'll do a site visit next week, and then we'll get to the bottom of this." I finished my shopping and left without confronting her, but I was concerned. A county building inspector was different from the HOA. They had actual legal authority. If they determined I had done something that violated building codes, I could face real fines, even legal action. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Miranda Cho, and she had an office in Missoula. Philip had recommended her, saying she had successfully defended several homeowners against HOA overreach in the past. Miranda listened to my story, occasionally making notes, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You painted your cabin to look like the surrounding forest, using camouflage techniques as a form of malicious compliance with the HOA's color requirements. That's accurate. And now the HOA president can't find your cabin to verify whether you've complied with her violation notice." "Also accurate," she laughed, a bright sound that made me feel considerably better about the situation. "Mr. Foster, this is the most creative response to HOA harassment I've encountered in my entire career. And the beautiful thing is, you haven't actually violated anything. You did paint your cabin. The fact that they don't like the specific paint job is irrelevant, especially since their updated color requirements weren't properly voted on by the community in the first place. What about the county building inspector? Did you alter the structure of your cabin? Change the footprint, the roof, anything that would require a building permit? No, it's purely cosmetic, paint and decorative elements. Then you're fine. Painting your house doesn't require a building permit. Adding decorative elements doesn't require a building permit. The inspector will come, verify that your cabin still exists and hasn't been modified in any structural way, and that will be the end of it. And Brenda, Miss Patterson is about to learn a very expensive lesson about harassment and improper enforcement of HOA rules. Once the inspector clears you, I recommend you file a formal complaint against her and the board for attempting to enforce guidelines that were never properly ratified. You might also consider a lawsuit for harassment. The documented pattern of violations, she's been citing the mailbox height, the vehicle parking. Now this color issue establishes a clear pattern of targeted harassment. I left Miranda's office feeling better than I had in weeks. The county inspector visited 5 days later, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert Chen, who had been doing building inspections for 20 years. Brenda insisted on accompanying him, along with Kenneth and Margaret. I met them at the road and walked them up to my property. Brenda was triumphant, clearly expecting the inspector to cite me for multiple violations. As we approached the cabin, I watched Robert's expression change from professional boredom to surprise to something like admiration. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, stopping about 30 feet from the deck. "That's remarkable." "What?" Brenda demanded. "What's remarkable?" Robert pointed at the cabin. "The camouflage work. It's incredibly well done. I'm standing here knowing there's a structure in front of me and my eyes still want to skip right past it." Brenda's face went red. "You can see the cabin." "Of course I can see it. It's right there." He walked forward, examining the painted surfaces, the netting, the careful detail work. "This is all just paint and decorative elements, no structural modifications." "That's correct," I said. "Would you like to come inside and verify? I have the original building plans and permits on file." We spent the next hour doing a thorough inspection. Robert checked everything: the foundation, the walls, the roof, the electrical, the plumbing. When he was done, he filled out his report and handed me a copy. "No violations," he said. "Your structure is sound, properly built, and fully compliant with all county building codes. The cosmetic changes are impressive, but they're just that, cosmetic. You don't need any permits for what you've done." Brenda snatched the report from my hands and read it, her face getting progressively more red. "This is ridiculous. He's clearly trying to circumvent the HOA guidelines." "The intent of the color requirements, madam," Robert interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't enforce HOA rules. I enforce building codes. This structure is fully compliant. If you have an issue with the paint color, that's between you and Mr. Foster, but it's not a county matter." He left, and Brenda stood there, trembling with rage. Kenneth looked like he was trying not to laugh. Margaret was studying her shoes with intense concentration. "This isn't over," Brenda said to me, her voice shaking. "You think you're clever, but I will find a way to make you comply with our community standards. You can't just make a mockery of the HOA." "Actually," I said calmly, "I can, and I have. Because your community standards were never properly ratified by the homeowners. I've consulted with a lawyer, Brenda. Your updated color requirements are unenforceable. You had no legal right to cite me for a violation in the first place." "That's not we have full authority. Show me the vote," I said. "Show me the 2/3 majority of homeowners who approved these new architectural guidelines, because according to the bylaws, that's required for any major changes to the covenant." Kenneth cleared his throat. "He's right, Brenda. We didn't put it to a community vote. You said we didn't need to because it was just clarifying existing standards." Brenda wheeled on him. "Don't you dare undermine me in front of a homeowner. We'll discuss this at the next board meeting." "I'll be at that meeting," I said, "and so will my lawyer. And we'll be bringing a formal complaint against you for harassment and improper enforcement of HOA rules." I watched as the three of them left, Brenda's back rigid with anger, Kenneth looking thoughtful, and Margaret practically running to keep up. I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to give up easily, but I had won this round decisively. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for July 15th, held in the community center at the entrance to Timber Ridge Estates. It was a large room with folding chairs arranged in rows, a table at the front for the board members, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. I arrived 15 minutes early with Miranda Cho. By the time the meeting started at 7 o'clock, the room was packed. Word had spread about my camouflage cabin, and apparently, a lot of residents wanted to see how this played out. Brenda called the meeting to order with her usual imperious manner. She went through the standard business, approving the minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget, addressing some landscaping concerns near the entrance. Then she got to what she clearly considered the main event. We need to address a serious issue of a homeowner deliberately flouting our community standards, she began, looking directly at me. Harrison Foster has refused to comply with legitimate architectural guidelines and has instead engaged in what can only be described as a childish prank that makes a mockery of our community. Miranda stood up. Point of order. Before we proceed with any discussion of violations, I'd like to address the legitimacy of the architectural guidelines in question. Brenda's jaw tightened. And who are you, Miranda Cho, attorney representing Mr. Foster? I have copies here of the original HOA covenant and bylaws, as well as the meeting minutes from the past 3 years. Can you please direct me to the community vote where the updated architectural guidelines, specifically the exterior color requirements, were approved by a 2/3 majority of homeowners? The room went silent. Every resident in attendance turned to look at Brenda. She opened and closed her mouth several times, then said, "The board has the authority to make reasonable modifications to community standards without requiring a full vote for every minor change." Miranda smiled. It was not a friendly expression. Actually, according to Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws, quote, "Any modifications to architectural standards, design guidelines, or appearance covenants must be approved by a 2/3 vote of all homeowners in good standing." The exterior color requirements are explicitly part of the architectural standards. There is no exception for what the board deems reasonable or minor. You needed a vote. You didn't get one. Therefore, the color requirements you've been attempting to enforce are invalid. I watched as the realization spread through the crowd. Several residents started whispering to each other. Philip, sitting near the front, was grinning openly. Kenneth cleared his throat. "She's correct, Brenda. I raised this concern when you first proposed the color guidelines last year, but you insisted we didn't need a community vote." "You're supposed to support the board," Brenda hissed at him. "I'm supposed to follow the bylaws," Kenneth replied, "which apparently we haven't been doing." A man in the back stood up. I recognized him as Thomas Reed, who owned one of the larger properties on the western edge of Timber Ridge. "So what you're saying is, the board has been enforcing rules that were never actually approved by the community. What other guidelines fall into that category?" Miranda pulled out another document. "I'm glad you asked. In addition to the color requirements, there are at least 6 other modifications to the original covenant that were implemented by the board without proper community approval. The vehicle parking restrictions, the mailbox height requirements, the limitations on outdoor furniture, the rules regarding garden structures, the regulations on exterior lighting, and the restrictions on fence materials." The whispering turned into open conversation. People were angry. Brenda had been using these rules to harass homeowners for years, and now they were learning that none of it had been legitimate. A woman named Carol Jennings, who I knew had been fined repeatedly for having the wrong type of outdoor furniture, stood up and pointed at Brenda. "You fined me $3,000 for having wicker chairs on my deck instead of the approved materials. I paid those fines because you said it was the rules. Are you telling me those fines weren't legitimate?" Brenda's face was purple. "The board acted in good faith to maintain property values and community standards. If there were minor procedural oversights, $3,000 is not a minor oversight," Carol shouted. Several other people stood up, also yelling about fines they had paid. Miranda held up her hands, calling for order. "If any homeowner has paid fines for violations of these improperly implemented guidelines, I encourage you to contact an attorney. You may have grounds to demand refunds and possibly to pursue legal action against the board for improper enforcement." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Brenda tried to maintain control, banging her gavel and calling for order, but at least half the residents had stopped paying attention to her. They were gathering in small groups, comparing notes about fines and violations they had received. Kenneth and Margaret looked shell-shocked. The other two board members, who had been mostly silent throughout the meeting, were having a heated discussion at the end of the table. Finally, Philip stood up, and his voice cut through the noise. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA board." "Seconded," at least a dozen people shouted. Brenda's face went from purple to white. "You can't, that's not on the agenda, according to the bylaws," Miranda said, consulting her documents. "Any homeowner can call for a vote of no confidence at any regular meeting, provided it receives a second, which it has. The vote must be conducted immediately by secret ballot." What followed was the most satisfying hour of my entire experience with the Timber Ridge Estates, HOA. Miranda oversaw the ballot distribution and collection to ensure everything was properly done. When the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. 83% of the homeowners present voted to remove the entire board from their positions. Brenda sat at the table, staring at the ballot count like it was a personal betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "This is a witch hunt. I have dedicated 8 years to improving this community, maintaining property values, ensuring standards are upheld. And this is how you repay me." "You abused your authority," Philip said flatly. "You used the HOA as your personal fiefdom, making up rules and harassing anyone who didn't comply with your vision of what the community should look like. You're lucky all we're doing is removing you from the board. Several people here have grounds to sue you personally." Brenda gathered her papers, slammed them into her briefcase, and stormed out of the community center. Margaret and one of the other board members followed her. Kenneth and the remaining board member stayed. Kenneth stood up and addressed the room. "I apologize to everyone here for not pushing back harder against these improper guidelines. I knew there were problems, but I didn't take action, and that was wrong. I'm willing to stay on temporarily to help transition to a new board, if the community wants that, but I understand if you'd prefer to start completely fresh." After some discussion, the homeowners voted to keep Kenneth and the other remaining board member, a retired teacher named Susan Hall, for transitional purposes only. They would serve for 60 days while a special election was organized to select a completely new board. In the meantime, all improperly implemented guidelines were suspended, and a committee was formed to review the entire covenant and bylaws to identify what needed to be updated, which updates required community votes, and how to prevent this kind of board overreach in the future. I was asked to serve on that committee, along with Philip, Carol, Thomas, and 3 other homeowners. We met twice a week for the next month, going through every page of the covenant with a fine-tooth comb. Miranda attended several of our meetings as a consultant, helping us understand the legal implications of various provisions. During this time, my camouflaged cabin became something of a local legend. People would drive up the dirt road just to see it, marveling at how effectively it blended into the forest. Several residents asked me for Dave's contact information, wanting to hire him for their own projects, not necessarily full cabin camouflage, but various creative landscaping and design work that pushed back against what they now saw as years of oppressive HOA control. Dave was delighted by the attention. "You've started a revolution," he told me when he came out to do some maintenance on the netting and foliage. "I've gotten 7 calls this month from your neighbors. Business is booming." The special election happened in mid-September. Kenneth chose not to run for a permanent position, saying he was ready to step back from HOA politics. Susan decided to run for secretary. The election was contentious, with multiple candidates for each position, but ultimately resulted in what everyone agreed was a more reasonable, community-focused board. Philip was elected president. Carol became vice president. Susan retained her position as secretary. A retired accountant named George Morrison became treasurer, and 3 other residents filled the remaining board positions. The new board's first action was to formally rescind all of the improperly implemented guidelines. Their second action was to issue a formal apology to all homeowners who had been fined under those guidelines, along with a commitment to review all fines and issue refunds where appropriate. Their third action was to implement new oversight procedures to prevent any future board from abusing their authority. I thought that would be the end of the saga, but in late October, I got a call from Miranda. "I have some news about Brenda Patterson," she said. "You might want to sit down for this." I was already sitting on my deck, enjoying the autumn colors in the mountains, but I braced myself. "What happened?" One of the other homeowners, Carol Jennings, filed a lawsuit against Brenda personally for the improper fines. During the discovery process, Carol's attorney found some very interesting discrepancies in the HOA financial records. It appears that Brenda had been siphoning money from the HOA accounts for years. Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. We're talking about roughly $75,000 over the past 6 years. I nearly dropped my phone. Embezzlement. That's what it looks like. Carol's attorney has turned the information over to the county prosecutor. They're investigating now, and it seems likely that Brenda will face criminal charges. How did she think she'd get away with that? She probably thought no one would ever look closely at the books. She controlled the board, she controlled the information flow, and most homeowners just paid their dues without questioning where the money went. If Carol hadn't filed that lawsuit, and if the discovery hadn't required a full financial audit, it might never have come to light. The criminal investigation moved forward through November and December. The county prosecutor, a meticulous woman named Angela Torres, built a case based on the financial records and interviewed multiple homeowners about their experiences with Brenda. In January, just over a year after my initial encounter with Brenda over the color violation, she was arrested and charged with embezzlement and fraud. The trial happened in March. I attended several days of testimony, watching as the prosecution methodically demonstrated how Brenda had used her position to steal from the community she claimed to serve. The defense argued that the financial irregularities were innocent mistakes, accounting errors rather than deliberate theft, but the pattern was too clear, too consistent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Brenda was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, including interest and legal fees. The judge, a stern man in his 60s named Richard Walsh, gave a scathing statement about the abuse of trust and position before imposing sentence. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, Philip shook his head in amazement. "All of this because she tried to make you paint your cabin." "Not exactly," I said. "All of this because she had been abusing her authority for years, and the cabin thing was finally the catalyst that made everyone realize what was happening. If she had just left me alone, she might have kept getting away with it." "Still," Philip said, "you have to admit, there's a certain poetic justice to it. She comes after you for a color violation, you camouflage your cabin so she can't find it. That leads to the board being removed, which leads to the financial investigation, which lands her in prison." "Karma's a hell of a thing," I agreed. The new HOA board used the restitution money to repair and improve community amenities that had been neglected during Brenda's tenure. The roads were repaved. The community center got a new roof, and they installed better signage and lighting at the entrance to Timber Ridge Estates. They also significantly reduced the monthly HOA dues, since a proper budget review revealed that Brenda had been charging far more than was necessary to maintain the community. As for my cabin, I kept the camouflage. I had grown fond of it, and it had become part of the local identity. Tour guides in Missoula started mentioning the invisible cabin in Timber Ridge as an interesting local oddity. A reporter from the Montana Standard came out to do a story about it, complete with photographs that had to be carefully composed because the cabin was so hard to see in pictures. The article went viral, and for a few weeks, I had people from all over the country contacting me about my malicious compliance masterpiece, as one blogger called it. Dave and I made some improvements to the camouflage over time, adjusting it for different seasons, replacing the netting when it wore out, updating the foliage to match the changing forest. It became a kind of ongoing art project, something I worked on whenever I needed a break from my consulting work, or just wanted to spend time outside. One afternoon in late spring, almost 18 months after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my deck when I heard someone walking up from the road. I looked over and saw Kenneth, the former vice president who had helped with the transition to the new board. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by," he called out. "Not at all. Want some coffee?" "I'd love some." We sat on the deck, looking out at the mountains, and Kenneth told me he had sold his house in Timber Ridge and was moving to Bozeman to be closer to his grandchildren. "I wanted to stop by before I left and thank you," he said. "Thank me? For what?" "For standing up to Brenda. For not just rolling over when she came after you with that ridiculous violation. I knew she was out of control, but I didn't have the courage to really confront her about it. If you hadn't pushed back, the rest of us would still be living under her tyranny and she'd still be stealing from the HOA. I just didn't want to paint my cabin," I said. "I wasn't trying to start a revolution." "Maybe not," Kenneth said, "but you did anyway. Sometimes that's how change happens. One person decides they've had enough and takes a stand, and it gives everyone else permission to stand up too." After he left, I thought about what he had said. I had come to Montana looking for peace, for a place where I could build something with my own hands and live without the corporate politics and bureaucratic nonsense I had dealt with for 3 decades. Instead, I had ended up in the middle of exactly that kind of conflict, just at a community level rather than a corporate one. But I had also learned something important. Communities are only as good as the people who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. Brenda had been able to abuse her authority for years because most people found it easier to just comply, to pay the fines and follow the rules, rather than challenge her. My camouflage cabin was silly. Yes, a petty response to petty tyranny. But it had also been effective in ways I never anticipated. It had exposed the illegitimacy of Brenda's authority, sparked a community-wide rebellion against HOA overreach, and ultimately led to the discovery of her embezzlement. Sometimes the best way to fight absurd rules is not with legal arguments or procedural challenges, but with an equally absurd response that makes people stop and question the entire system. The new HOA board settled into a pattern of competent, unobtrusive management. They maintained the roads and common areas, enforced the legitimate rules about safety and basic property maintenance, and otherwise left homeowners alone. They held regular meetings where actual community issues were discussed and voted on. They were transparent about finances and decision-making. In short, they ran the HOA the way it was supposed to be run, as a service to the community, not as a tool for control. I continued to serve on the Architectural Review Committee, now properly constituted and focused on preserving the natural character of Timber Ridge rather than enforcing arbitrary aesthetic preferences. We approved a wide variety of home styles and designs, as long as they met basic safety standards and didn't create genuine nuisances for neighbors. The community became more diverse, more interesting, more reflective of the actual people who lived there rather than one person's vision of what it should be. My cabin remained a source of conversation and occasional amusement. During hunting season, I'd sometimes see trucks slow down on the road as hunters tried to spot it, treating it like a kind of real-world Where's Waldo. Kids would ask their parents if they could hike up to see the magic invisible house. And whenever someone new moved to Timber Ridge, one of the first things the neighbors would tell them about was Harrison Foster's camouflage cabin and the story of how it brought down a corrupt HOA president. I never did paint my cabin in one of Brenda's approved colors. The natural wood was gone, covered by camouflage, but I preferred it this way. Every time I looked at my home, I was reminded that sometimes the best response to unreasonable authority is creative resistance. Not violence, not aggression, but imagination and a willingness to push back in unexpected ways. Dave came by in late June to help me do the seasonal update to the camouflage. We were replacing some of the netting and adding fresh foliage when he asked me if I'd ever gotten tired of the joke. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The whole camouflage thing. It's been 2 years now. You ever think about just going back to natural wood or painting it a normal color?" I looked at the cabin, at the careful patterns we had created, at the way it seemed to breathe with the forest around it. "No," I said. "This is what it's supposed to be now. It's not a joke anymore. It's just who I am and what I built. A cabin that doesn't want to be seen in a community that learned to see what really mattered." Dave nodded, satisfied with that answer, and we got back to work. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I sat on my deck with a beer and reflected on the strange journey of the past 2 years. I had come to Montana to escape complexity and find simplicity. Instead, I had found community, conflict, resolution, and ultimately a kind of peace that could only come from standing up for what mattered. My cabin was still camouflaged, still blending into the forest, still confusing the occasional visitor who couldn't quite figure out where the trees ended and the structure began. But I could see it clearly, because I knew what I was looking for. I knew every painted shadow, every artificial branch, every carefully chosen color. It was mine, built with my own hands, decorated with my own rebellion, and it represented everything I had come here to find. The HOA could establish whatever rules they wanted now, properly voted on and legitimate, and I would follow them because they made sense and served the community. But no one would ever again tell me that my home didn't belong in the forest, that natural materials and creative expression had to bow to someone else's narrow vision of acceptable aesthetics. I had made my cabin invisible to prove a point, and in doing so, I had made myself impossible to ignore. That paradox seemed fitting somehow, like the perfect summary of what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of petty tyranny and respond with imagination instead of anger. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear above the mountains, I went inside my camouflaged cabin, turned on the lights, and felt grateful for the strange path that had led me here. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in a home that most people couldn't see, in a community that had learned to see past the surface, and I'd be exactly where I belonged. The story of my HOA battle became one of those local legends that gets told and retold, gaining details and embellishments with each version. Some people said I had used military-grade optical illusion technology. Others claimed the cabin actually shifted positions depending on where you stood. A few conspiracy theorists insisted there was no cabin at all, that I was living in an underground bunker, and the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. The truth was simpler and more satisfying. I had taken an absurd situation and responded with equal absurdity, exposing the illegitimacy of overreaching authority and triggering consequences that went far beyond what anyone expected. My cabin was still there, still camouflaged, still standing as a monument to creative resistance and the power of refusing to simply accept unreasonable demands. And every time someone drove past my property, squinting into the trees and wondering where exactly the cabin was hidden, I smiled from my deck and took another sip of coffee, content in the knowledge that sometimes the best way to be seen is to disappear completely.